Hey, welcome back to the Read Report. Thanks so much for watching. I'm so excited to get into this week's testimony, you guys. The Commonwealth has officially rested its case. Now, will it be enough to prove beyond reasonable doubt, one, if any, of the charges against Karen Read? I'm not sure. The question, I think, will ultimately come down to whether or not they did prove beyond reasonable doubt that she struck John O'Keefe with her vehicle. I don't know if that's been proven. Obviously, we heard earlier this past week from Alan Jackson trying to, again, ask the Commonwealth to drop the charges, which pretty much happens all the time in these criminal trials. They do one last Hail Mary to try to get the state to dismiss the case. And we heard his arguments basically stating that definitely as it comes to counts 1 and counts 3, that is the second-degree murder and leaving the scene of an injury resulting in the death. He said, Jackson that is, said that no way has the Commonwealth proven these charges beyond reasonable doubt. He did kind of, which I thought was interesting, separate out that involuntary manslaughter charge. And he says that, that one, we should treat that one a little bit differently than the other two, basically stating that the evidence for that one might be a little bit stronger or easier for the reasonable person to discern is possible compared to the 1 and 3, which, again, we've been through this together. Reasonable doubt, and they're going to hear in these jury instructions, we're going to see it once the defense finishes their case. Reasonable doubt is really to the highest degree of moral certainty. So it really requires the Commonwealth to bear the burden of proof, and to a serious degree, they have to have proven their case in order for the jury to find Karen Read guilty of anything here. So we'll see what jurors have to think about that when we get closer to the conclusion of this trial this time around, and we'll be getting into the weeds with the jury instructions. So all that being said, at this point, we haven't heard closing arguments. We also haven't heard the rebuttal from Welcher, because we know that the Commonwealth has been allowed to call Welcher back to essentially refute ARCA and the defense expert's version of the case. He's going to get to pull Welcher back onto the stand to poke holes in the defense's theory of what happened that night. So that's going to be interesting, and I know we're not completely done hearing from Hank Brennan. We know that, quite honestly, Hank Brennan, despite not necessarily coming across as super likable, in my opinion, he has done a pretty good job, or shown that he's at least proficient in the art of cross-examination, because we know that Brennan himself is a former defense attorney, so he kind of knows what questions to ask. The way he does it, though, in my opinion, might not always be the brightest, and it might cause a little bit of stomach churning and some kind of eye rolls in terms of how the jury might be perceiving things, because reportedly from reports inside the courtroom, we're hearing that the jury at times is getting kind of annoyed, visibly reacting to some of Hank Brennan's questioning of the defense's witnesses so far. So, again, all remains to be seen, and ultimately it's going to come down to how the jury is perceiving this, and it ultimately comes down to, I think, whether or not they're going to be able to look at the facts of the case and say, beyond reasonable doubt, did the Commonwealth prove that Karen Read struck John O'Keefe with her vehicle? Again, beyond a reasonable doubt. If they haven't proven it, she's presumed to be innocent. If they haven't proven it, they have to acquit her. These are part of the instructions that they will hear, which we'll get into when we get closer to the end of this trial. So a lot is still to be seen. I know from the defense's side of things, we're going to be hearing from not just people who we heard about at the last trial. We're not going to just be rehashing some of these Proctor text messages, whether that's through actually calling Proctor himself or hearing them secondhand from some of the friends who were on Proctor's text messages when he was disparaging Karen Read and, kind of in my opinion, showing bias, making jokes about looking for nudes on her phone, all these terrible things that you would never ever want someone with such a high role in the state police, someone who's ultimately, he's supposed to determine what actually happened in impartial way and to not show bias and to be objective and to look for both sides and not just come to a conclusion within hours of this whole thing starting. So, it's going to be interesting to hear some of that come back in, but also I do think that the defense is going to drop some other bombshells this time. We're going to hear from some people, some witnesses who we haven't heard from yet, who I think the prosecution might be getting a little nervous about. The prosecution might be digging around saying, hey, like we know with Kelly Dever, for example, one of the witnesses that she came on Friday, she was summoned on Friday. We saw her briefly interact with Judge Cannone, and Judge Cannone basically said, hey, we're going to need you back here on Monday. We're not going to get to you today. Now, Kelly Dever, Jen, shout out if you're watching. Jen's her sister. I grew up with the Devers. They're great kids. Kelly actually worked for the Canton Police Department. No longer works for the Canton Police Department, but she was working the night that John O'Keefe was killed, and she dispatched them to John O'Keefe's location. So we're going to hear from Kelly Dever, and it's going to be interesting. I think we might hear more about what potentially went on at Canton Police Station that night. Maybe Dever was there when Higgins came in. There are all these suspicions online about what Dever might be testifying to. I have 100% confidence in what Dever will testify to, and we'll see what happens. So I think we're going to get more bombshells from the defense this time around. I think it will be interesting to hear from other people and hopefully get more insight into what the defense was able to dig up in their own private investigation of what may have happened that night. So, all that being said, right now where I think Hank Brennan left off was kind of unnoteworthy. It was almost just random when he rested the case. I don't feel like he threaded that needle at the end. Now I know we're not done hearing from Hank. Hank's going to come back, and he will have, hopefully, wrapped this all up with a tight little bow in his closing. But, again, it's going to come down to that reasonable doubt. It's going to come down to whether or not the jury actually believes she struck him and whether or not they're willing to come to a unanimous verdict on any of these charges. So, what do you guys think so far? What do you think about the Commonwealth's case thus far? Because they've rested. We heard Alan Jackson try to argue a motion to dismiss, which was immediately denied by Judge Cannone, but we heard him kind of separating out charges 1 and 3. They said, hey, I don't think that the state has proven their case at all beyond a reasonable doubt in any of the charges, is what Alan Jackson said. But specifically on charges 1 and 3, we really ask that you treat those charges differently because there's really so much reasonable doubt when it comes to the first and the third charge. The first being second-degree murder and the third being leaving the scene of an accident resulting in serious injury or death. So, all that being said, we know that Judge Cannone said, nah, you guys, we're not. Your motion to dismiss has been denied again, which, again, is not surprising. But taking all this into totality, maybe the defense is seeing that the Commonwealth had a stronger case this time around for that second charge, the involuntary manslaughter. Maybe they are seeing, okay, yeah, Judge, please, we think it's all junk, but the second one, we see that there's at least more of a case being built this time around when it comes to that second one. But yeah, so I think ultimately, I will also say, and I've said this before, Hank Brennan overall, I think he's done a better job at telling the story than Adam Lally. I think you can say what you want about his style, about how the jurors may be interpreting some of his intense, argumentative cross-examinations of some of the defense's experts so far. They might not like it. Reports from inside the courtroom are stating that they are not liking some of Hank Brennan's cross-examination of the defense witnesses. They're kind of rolling their eyes and being like, this guy, stop it, Hank, that sort of thing. But again, who knows? I haven't seen that myself, so I'm not sure. And I think that overall, Hank, yes, he's done a better job presenting the case, and also he's tapped some more credible experts this time around. Obviously, we know Burgess is completely separate because he was misrepresenting and at times lying about his education. He did come forward on the stand and kind of admit to these discrepancies in his various CVs, and we know that he was pursuing his degree, his bachelor's degree, for 17 years. So that's crazy. And do I think he necessarily has all the correct credentials to be doing and testifying to what he was asked to testify to? Not necessarily. But Welcher, on the other hand, Welcher, I think he is a little more trustworthy. He actually did some science, in my opinion, compared to at least the state's experts last time. Trooper Paul, who was testifying to the Commonwealth's theory of the case and what they allege happened with Karen Reed striking and killing John O'Keefe at the last trial, I feel like he was kind of a joke. But this time around, Welcher, he was part of Aperture, this firm that the Commonwealth contracted out over $300,000 to do these accident reconstructionist and expert investigations into their theory of the case. Know that Welcher appears to have actually done some experiments. He appears to have actually backed in to himself, who he estimates to be about the same size, height as John O'Keefe, and he pretended to hold a glass, and as he was holding that glass, he had painted the Karen Reed's taillight of the SUV. So he basically bought an SUV, which is the same exact model, size, everything of Karen's SUV, and he painted in blue paint the portion of her SUV that they say was damaged by striking John. And then he did an experiment where he had the SUV slowly, albeit it wasn't backing up at any intense speed, but he had the SUV slowly backing into his arm as if he were John O'Keefe. And you can see in his recreation of the event that happened that the transfer of the blue paint actually aligns with a lot of where John's injuries were sustained on his arm. Whether or not John's injuries themselves actually look like they came from a taillight, look like they came from being struck, that I think is a little bit too difficult to allege, but I do think that he did at least make me take a second glance into things. So I want to show you a little bit here of what Welcher did and see what you guys have to think. So here are some of the slides that were admitted into evidence from Welcher. Now this slide was a video, so we don't have the actual video in this deck, but we can see a screenshot basically of what's going on here. And what you can see is here are John O'Keefe's actual injuries on his arm. And again, they do kind of look like scratches to me. They don't really necessarily look like he got hit by an SUV. But you can see that here is the exact model of Karen Reed's Lexus SUV with blue paint on the upper portion of her taillight where the damage was sustained. And you can see in this recreation that he does, he paints the taillight and he has the car actually back into him as though he were John O'Keefe. He's about the same size as John O'Keefe. He's holding the cocktail glass that John O'Keefe presumably left Waterfall with in hand that night, and also presumably left Karen Reed's vehicle with in hand that night. And what you can see is she was able to demonstrate that transfer from this contact with someone of John O'Keefe's size shows that the blue paint on Welcher's arm aligns similarly with where the injuries are on John O'Keefe's arm. So again, is this a smoking gun? Did he do this exact demonstration of the Commonwealth case in its entirety, going the exact speed that they report Karen Reed was reversing into John O'Keefe that night? No. Did they actually have someone of his actual, or use a dummy of his actual size, weight, all that, and have the SUV going at that exact speed? No. But I think it is interesting because it got me at least thinking that, hey, maybe is it possible that those injuries did actually come from being struck? I don't know. What will the jurors think about it? And the other thing that I briefly showed a few slides ago, which we're going to see again, is Welcher was able to do this recreation of these surveillance videos. We saw the ring footage from John O'Keefe's house actually showing Karen Read backing into his SUV. His SUV wheels jolt a little bit, and the defense is stating this is actually how she damaged her taillight. So he was able to take the surveillance footage, Welcher, and he was able to recreate it with this 3D modeling and essentially overlay Karen Read's vehicle backing into John O'Keefe to what he calls demonstrate a high degree of engineering certainty that the point of impact between these two SUVs was not where Karen Read's damage to her taillight was. It would have been more likely between the bumpers. So basically, he's stating that even if she did back into his car, which we think that she did, you can see that where the damage would have been sustained from Karen Read backing into his car was actually nowhere near where that taillight was damaged. So I do think that at least this time around, looks like some real science investigation work is being done in this case, as opposed to Trooper Paul, who, as we know from one of the jurors who came on here, as we know from Ronnie, he basically said you would have thought he would have opened a book about physics. Like, Trooper Paul, no offense, seemed like a nice guy, probably not the right person to have as your expert witness to testify to what may have happened. And then we have someone like Welcher, who has a little bit more qualifications. He's pointed to actual scientific studies. He's able to do some of these things, not just to prove or potentially prove what the Commonwealth's theory of the events is, but also to come in and try to refute some of what the defense is alleging happened. So I do think the jurors are going to have a little bit more of a harder time, maybe not, but because we never know how a jury's going to react, as we know. But I think that if I were a juror on this case compared to a juror on last case, I might have more questions and more likelihood of believing some portion of the Commonwealth's theory of events in its totality. Again, do I trust them? Do I trust that the investigation was performed with such integrity and all that? No, I absolutely do not. And I think we're going to hear more about that as we get into the defense's case more this time around. So as I mentioned, we're going to hear from some more witnesses in this retrial on the defense's side than we did before. And I think we're going to get into more mic drop moments. I think even though a lot of it's going to be rehashing what we already know, we also are going to learn something new. And I think that I don't know what happened in this case, but I think the truth probably does lie somewhere in the middle. And there is zero question in my mind that the Canton police did not fulfill their duties appropriately that night or that morning when they responded to the incident outside of 34 Fairview Road. And I think that their willingness to protect the townies, willingness to protect fellow law enforcement members, except for John O'Keefe, clearly, basically, I think points to too much doubt in my mind. And hopefully the jurors will see it that way. I don't know, though. So, all to say, what do you guys think? Do you guys feel like the Commonwealth's theory of events is more believable this time around? What questions or what things would stick out to you in your mind if you were a juror deliberating on this case, apart from what we know about this case because we've been following it for years? Apart from that, if you were just hearing all this for the first time and you were just now trying to formulate this impartial view of what may have happened that night with the facts and evidence presented to you in this case, knowing nothing about all the other background information, knowing nothing about the federal investigation, which they say is now over, would you feel at this point that the Commonwealth has proven any of these charges beyond reasonable doubt? And do you think that the defense is going to be dropping more bombshells? Because I certainly do. I think we're going to hear from former Canton Police Department workers who are going to talk about the handling of the case that night, and who are going to talk about the politics, who are going to talk about potential protection of the Albert family at 34 Fairview Road. And one of those witnesses, Kelly Dever, we know she now works for the Boston Police Department. And Kelly, I grew up with. I know her sister, Jen. Jen, if you're watching, what's up? Hope you're doing well. And I think that Kelly is going to be a very credible witness for the defense, and she's probably going to be asked to testify to how the investigation was initiated that night, and maybe how some of her former coworkers at the Canton Police Department attempted to cover up or demonstrate at least a little bit of bias in their handling or their response to this case. Now, before we say goodbye this week, I want to show you a brief clip on Twitter that I found of Kelly Dever, who was on dispatch that night or that morning that John O'Keefe was found. We hear her talking to Lieutenant Gallagher. Gallagher is now retired. He used to be on the Canton Police Department, and he responded that morning. And you can hear their exchange and how it seems as though there was an immediate attempt to protect Brian Albert, because Brian Albert, we know he had close ties to the Canton Police Department. Kevin Albert, his own brother, is on the force. And we know that he was kind of allowed, like Higgins, some special permissions in the police department. This has been reported by former Canton Police Department workers. We know that there was this willingness to protect this family. Now, again, all that being said, does that mean that they did something wrong? Does that mean no? It doesn't mean the Alberts themselves did something wrong or the McCabe's did something wrong necessarily. It just means that we know that their influence in the Canton Police Department and in that town is significant. And we see that. We still see that to this day. All to say, here is a little clip of when Dever was talking to Lieutenant Paul Gallagher and responding to that incident at 32 Fairview Road is what's reported. 32, not 34. So, again, we're going to hear from Kelly this coming week. I think she's going to tell the truth. And I think that this might help bolster some of the defense's claims as to how this investigation was conducted. And you can hear just in that recording, it certainly sounds like they are referring to Brian Albert. And Lieutenant Paul Gallagher is pretty happy to hear that it's not even his house. Him probably referring to Brian Albert, because as we know, the Canton Police Department is quite familiar with the Albert family. So, what does this point to? Does this show any smoking gun that taillight was planted at the scene? No. But does it perhaps speak to how this investigation was initially conducted before the Canton Police Department recused themselves, even though we know that they still had their fingers in the pot when it comes to arranging witness interviews? Kevin Albert was reportedly helping out his friend, Michael Proctor, at the Mass State Police with arranging some of these witness interviews, and we know that that shouldn't have been the case. He should have been recused. Again, I think the defense is going to do a great job at sowing a lot of reasonable doubt in the jurors' minds, and hopefully that will be enough to equip Karen Reed. But again, it's not cut and dry, and I think the jury has seen and perhaps will hear more in the closing arguments about some actual facts, some actual evidence in this case this time around, whereas last time the Commonwealth's theory of events was just almost too hard to wrap your head around, with Trooper Paul alleging that basically John O'Keefe did a pirouette, and that's how he got struck and was injured and laid in his final resting place. So what do you guys think? Do you guys feel like the Commonwealth's case, as it stands right now, is strong enough? What do you think? Hope you guys have a great week, and thank you as always for joining the Reed Report.